Hello everybody and welcome back to the Not Applicable Formula 1 channel. This weekend saw the 5th round of the Formula 1 2023 season in Miami and everyone seems so disappointed. You guys even rated it a 3-star race. I thought it was a pretty great race weekend, and with the added entertainment of all the Americanness, if we can say that, it's very cringe but also very fun. Now, how about you guys hit the subscriber button and I will rank the Formula 1 drivers from the Miami Grand Prix weekend from best to worst. Starting off with who else but Fernando Alonso, who I predicted to have a flop this weekend, and after a tough Miami Grand Prix last year with Alpine, I feel like it was a fair shout. But this year, his fortunes have completely changed, and he drove an incredibly comfortable third place finish. Like, he was so bored, he started watching the race on the big screens. 4 third place finish trophies in 5 races, and on top of that, he was my driver of the day. Having said that, the only thing that drops Max Verstappen to second place on this list is the fact he made the smallest of errors in qualifying, meaning that he didn't get his banker lap in. I think he still would have picked up pole position had Charles Leclerc not brought out the red flag, but then starting from 9th place, it wasn't really part of the plan, but he was faultless anyway. It took him just 15 laps to reach Alonso and take second place. Then he had excellent pace on that first stint, which meant he was much closer to Sergio Perez after his pit stop than he anticipated, and then the subsequent pass for the lead on the medium tyres was inevitable. Given just how slow that Mercedes car looked like it was going to be this weekend, George Russell did a brilliant job. Qualifying in 6th place may have been a touch lucky, again considering the red flag, but he made the most of it, and the Mercedes race pace was able to salvage a solid points finish in 4th. He drove an excellent first stint, passing Gasly, then catching and passing Carlos Sainz in the second stint too. The Ferraris, I feel like, were definitely the target for Mercedes this weekend, and Russell got the better of them both. Whilst his teammate Lewis Hamilton, it has to be said, had a slightly less straightforward Sunday, but was also able to make the best of a bad car. Being in the mix, starting in 13th place, almost ended in disaster straight away, to be fair, as he brushed Nico Hülkenberg on the first lap, but he stuck in there and waited to pounce. Going on the reverse strategy, like Max Verstappen, meant that he was released from that DRS train behind Albon, and then put in some great laps, allowing him to swap onto the mediums and fly by the likes of Magnussen, Leclerc, and Gasly into 6th place. I'm rating Sergio Perez's 5th best this weekend, which may seem a little bit harsh considering he started on pole position, but it was always about the battle with Max Verstappen in the race, and for Perez, he came out second best. And yes, it was inevitable that Perez would lose that lead to Verstappen after Verstappen pitted, despite doing his best to defend, but he just wasn't able to make the most of those first 15 laps whilst Verstappen was battling through the field. Just marginally disappointing considering the circumstances after qualifying. Gasly is up next, and I'm so happy to see him bounce back after he threw away his result in Australia and had a horrible weekend in Azerbaijan too. Having qualified in 5th place, unfortunately, he just had to concede that the Alpine just is not as fast as the top 4 teams. Like, he drove really well and largely avoided any battles so that he didn't lose any time in those lost causes with teams he wasn't really fighting, and actually it paid off as he finished in 8th place and still ahead of Esteban Ocon, who was on the better strategy. I really wasn't sure where to put Carlos Sainz in all of this, so I kind of just slotted him here in 7th place. He still doesn't look comfortable enough in the car to get anywhere close to the pace of Charles Leclerc, but he was much more reliable this weekend than his opposite number, it has to be said. In the race, he did manage to undercut Alonso, but then he also picked up a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane whilst doing so. It kind of just was a bit of a weird weekend. Then obviously he had trouble on the hard compound tyre, which meant that he was passed by Alonso and then Russell towards the end of the Grand Prix, as the Ferrari just still can't hold on to a set of tyres. I just really didn't know where to put Sainz. Next up is Kevin Magnussen. I think it's the first weekend this year that he's actually had an overall better weekend than his teammate. He outqualified Nico Hülkenberg for the first time this year and did it in classic Magnussen emphatic fashion, starting on the 2nd row of the grid. He was never going to be able to stay there, don't get me wrong, but he still could dream, and it was nice to see him have some excellent battles with Charles Leclerc over the course of the Grand Prix. Then he also managed to hold on to a point in 10th place, which was probably the maximum that he could have gotten. Moving on to the first driver on this list, who actually finished outside of the points in Miami. He actually had a pretty rough Saturday too, did Yuki Tsunoda. For the first time this year, Nick de Vries got the better of the Japanese driver. It was in the race, though, that he made up for it. After a crazy starting lap at the back, he was all the way up into 15th. He then followed Hamilton's lead and stayed put in that midfield DRS train until he was freed by the rest of them pitting. He overcut Nico Hülkenberg during his stop and then made excellent moves on Albon and Bottas once he was on the mediums, to culminate in another 11th place, the 3rd time this year. He was a second and a half behind Kevin Magnussen. It was just another solid performance to add to his 2023 list. Ocon actually went for the inverse strategy too, starting on the hard compound tyre and running super long on that first stint, but wheel spin off the line actually meant that he lost a place to Valtteri Bottas, although he would then get the better of Valtteri Bottas later on anyway. It was a fairly straightforward race for Esteban Ocon, but that's exactly what he needed after the start of the season that he's had, like managing to secure just a comfortable 9th place in a couple of points. The reason he isn't higher on this list though is because if he had done a little bit better in his first stint, he definitely could have fought his friend turned rival turned teammate for 8th place. Along with Tsunoda, another Red Bull Junior who is having an insane start to this season is Alex Albon, who again showed his pace without picking up any points. He managed to qualify in 11th place and finish in 14th, which is, in a Williams, very impressive anyway, but it's more impressive when a lot of the Williams engineers are stunned by the lap times he was able to get out of that car when they were convinced they were going to be absolutely nowhere in Miami. I've been incredibly critical of Valtteri Bottas since Bahrain, and I feel like it's been justified considering the performances from the Finn, but I will give him credit when he deserves it, and after Miami, he deserves it. He flattered a very awkward to drive Alfa Romeo car. In qualifying, he managed to get that Alfa Romeo its first Q3 appearance of the year. Predictably, he regressed a little bit in the race, but you can't really be too mad at him for falling behind Hamilton, Tsunoda, and Stroll. Even though he lost places, he did incredibly well. I'm not going to lie, I think this is the first weekend that I've been disappointed by Nico Hülkenberg. He made a mistake in FP1, which led to the car colliding with the wall. He made another mistake in Q2 at turn 1, costing him his place in Q3, and then he failed to make the most of the strategy that Verstappen, Hamilton, and Tsunoda made look so good. Like, he started in 12th place, found the car tricky to drive in traffic, and then finished 15th. It wasn't a great weekend. I feel like this one might be a little bit contentious, putting a McLaren even as high as 14th after Miami, but Lando Norris was eliminated in Q1. I feel that was more down to the car than Lando though, as it struggles with those slower speed and longer corners, but Lando Norris started on the soft compound tyre, which was a big surprise to everybody, and it almost paid off. He actually gained a lot of places from the start. Unfortunately, he was then rear-ended by Nick de Vries, which dropped him to the back of the pack, and then he was just running around in 17th place. And whilst we talk about McLaren, I'm putting Piastri next. Almost identical to Lando Norris, really. Dropped out in Q1 because the car is terrible, and then started on the soft compound tyre, made up places, and then reliability struck. He had a brake-by-wire problem, giving him a really long brake pedal, started 19th, finished 19th. Can we as McLaren fans just agree to forget that this race ever happened? Next up is Zhou Guanyu, who's actually been outperforming Valtteri Bottas in qualifying recently, but just didn't quite have the same connection with the car this weekend in qualifying, as he exited in Q2, only managing 14th place. The Alfa Romeos then split the strategies, and Zhou started on the hard compound tyre like Verstappen. He spent the first part of the race, though, in that really long DRS train in the midfield, and given the car's race pace just wasn't really there, he was only able to pick off Norris when he was on the mediums in that final stint. Just a bit of a nondescript weekend from Zhou, really. Although someone's weekend that was very easy to describe is Charles Leclerc's. Shall I give it a go? I mean, horrible, terrible, awful. Shall I go on? Like, I know he said that Ferrari was aggressively set up this weekend, but to crash in practice and in qualifying at the exact same corner just shouldn't happen. And actually, qualifying in 7th place wasn't the worst. Verstappen and Hamilton were both behind that. It was just Leclerc made no progress in the race. He killed his tyres battling with Kevin Magnussen of all people, and then that meant he lost out to Lewis Hamilton later on in the race. And after a wonderful Baku, it's back to disappointment for Charles Leclerc fans. However, in my opinion, it wasn't as bad as Lance Stroll, whose entire weekend crumbled when he qualified in 18th place. Like, why Aston Martin didn't put him on a fresh set of tyres, I do not know. But from that position, I guess you could say that Lance Stroll did a decent job in the race. Like, he was also stuck in that DRS train that I've mentioned for so many drivers outside of the top 10 early on in this Grand Prix. But like Hamilton, he waited and did manage to overtake Hülkenberg, Albon, Bottas in that second stint, but finishing 12th and struggling to get into the points while your teammate is casually gliding around in 3rd place, it's just not a good look. Nick, what on earth are we going to do with you? Like, I was ready to praise him after qualifying. He did a good job. He reached Q2, he out-qualified Tsunoda, and I was like, maybe this is the first weekend from Nick de Vries that's going to be really good. Cut to turn 1 of lap 1, and he's inside the McLaren of Lando Norris. Like, he got away without any major damage to the car, but more damage was done to his reputation, that's certain. Last in qualifying, last in the race, Nicholas Latifi vibes from Logan this weekend at his first home Grand Prix. Like, he clipped the back of Lance Stroll on lap 1, broke his front wing. That meant coming in for an almost 30-second pit stop. He actually had okay lap-by-lap pace considering, but I doubt he even saw another car until he was lapped by the leaders. And finally, my favourite moment from this weekend was definitely Formula 1 legend Jackie Stewart being bodied by a security guard whilst trying to get Martin Brundle an interview with tennis star Roger Federer. Like, it was peak grid walk madness. But I'd love to know your favourite moment in the comments down below. And whilst you're down there, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and I'll see you next time.